Starfleet transport. Hold your position. We've got you.
I want to start tonight with a small detail that, once you hear the whole story, is going to break your heart a little. For 4 months, a pilot at a mid-sized regional training wing sat through every single briefing without once being asked a direct question by anyone running the room. Not because anyone disliked her, because nobody had thought to. She was just there, present, competent, quiet, and somehow, in 4 months, that had translated into invisible. Then one gray Tuesday afternoon, a distress call came screaming across an emergency frequency, followed by a callback that made a control tower full of controllers go completely silent, because the call sign attached to that response belonged to someone none of them had ever heard identify herself out loud before, and every single one of them had absolutely no idea what they were about to learn. If you love stories about the quiet ones, the ones who could tell you exactly who they are and simply choose not to, until the moment demands it, hit subscribe before we go any further, because that's the entire heart of this channel. And tonight, I want you playing a small game with me. Somewhere in this story, before I tell you her call sign, you're going to have a guess forming in the back of your mind. When you feel it land, stop the video and drop it in the comments. I want to know exactly where you were in the story when it clicked. Let's rewind, because to really feel what happened in that tower, you have to understand just how thoroughly this woman had disappeared into the background of her own squadron. Her name, for tonight's story, was Major Elena Vasquez, 38 years old, transferred into a regional training wing roughly 4 months before the events of this story, under circumstances that, to everyone around her, looked entirely unremarkable. New instructor, mid-career, competent flight record on paper, nothing that jumped off the page and demanded anyone's attention. She showed up, did her job, and largely kept to herself, not cold, not standoffish exactly, just quiet in the specific way that, over time, teaches the people around you to stop expecting much conversation and start filling that space with someone louder instead. I think it's worth pausing here, because I don't think this story works if we don't sit honestly with how normal all of this actually was. Nobody in that squadron was being cruel to Elena. There's no villain in the early part of this story, not really. What happened to her was something quieter and, in its own way, more universal. The specific, slow erosion of visibility that happens to people who don't perform their competence loudly enough for a room to notice it. She answered when spoken to. She did her job well. And in 4 months, exactly nobody had bothered to ask her a single question about the career she'd had before she walked through that squadron's doors. Here's something I want you holding on to while we go tonight, because I think it matters more than it sounds like it should. How many people in your own life do you actually know, versus how many have you just quietly filed away as the quiet one and stopped wondering about? Sit with that. We're going to need it later. What nobody in that training wing knew, because Elena had never once volunteered it, and nobody had ever asked directly enough to find out, was that before that assignment, she had spent nearly a decade flying some of the most demanding advanced reconnaissance and precision strike missions her branch conducted. Missions that, for reasons entirely outside her control, remained largely undiscussed even within her own community, the specific kind of operational history that gets quietly folded into a service record without ever making its way into casual conversation. She'd flown in conditions that most pilots training under her at that regional wing would likely never face in their entire careers, genuine high-stakes operational scenarios where the margin for error measured in feet and seconds, not the comfortable, controlled margins of a routine training sortie. She'd earned, over the course of that decade, a reputation among the small, tightly knit community of people who'd actually flown alongside her, a reputation built entirely on results rather than reputation building, which is, I think, exactly why it had never traveled with her the way reputations sometimes do for louder people. The call sign she carried from that decade wasn't something she'd picked. It had been given to her, the way these things usually happen, after a specific mission that had left a lasting impression on the people who witnessed it. During an extraordinarily demanding operational flight involving a rapidly deteriorating situation on the ground that required precision support delivered under conditions that left almost no room for hesitation, Elena had executed with a level of composed, surgical accuracy that one senior officer reviewing the mission afterward described as the kind of flying you write training manuals about, except almost nobody could actually replicate it. The name that stuck, quietly, permanently, among the small circle of people who knew her that way, was Widow's Hour. Not dramatic in the way it sounds out loud, more a reference, among the pilots who understood it, to the specific window of a mission when everything genuinely hangs in the balance, and to how completely, unnervingly steady she'd been standing inside it. None of that traveled to the regional training wing with her. All anyone there saw was a quiet instructor doing quiet, competent work, and in the absence of any louder story to attach to her, that's exactly the story the squadron settled on. For 4 months, that arrangement simply continued. Elena taught her assigned classes, flew her assigned training sorties, and went home most evenings without much fanfare, her actual history sitting completely dormant, known to no one, needed by no one, until the Tuesday that changed all of that in about 90 seconds. The afternoon started ordinarily enough. A routine training day, moderate weather, nothing on the schedule that suggested anything unusual was coming. Elena wasn't even flying that day. She was working ground instruction, running a classroom session for a handful of newer pilots, when the base's emergency frequency picked up a distress call that had absolutely nothing to do with her squadron at all. A civilian medical transport aircraft, ferrying a critically injured patient between facilities, had run into a serious in-flight mechanical problem roughly 30 miles from the base, a problem serious enough that the pilot, working alone with no co-pilot and a patient whose condition made time itself the single scarcest resource in the entire situation, needed guidance considerably more specialized than what the base's on-duty controllers, trained for standard traffic management rather than genuine emergency response, were equipped to provide quickly enough. The young controller working that frequency that afternoon, doing everything by the book, doing everything right by the standards he'd actually been trained for, found himself facing a scenario that was rapidly outpacing what his training had prepared him to handle smoothly. According to his own account afterward, he could hear the tension climbing in the pilot's voice on the other end of that frequency, and he knew, with the particular clarity that comes with genuine crisis, that he needed help considerably more specialized than anything he could offer alone, and he needed it immediately. Elena, in the classroom nearby, heard enough of the escalating radio traffic bleeding through an open door to understand exactly what was happening, and according to 3 students who were sitting in that classroom with her, what happened next took maybe 4 seconds from start to finish. She stopped mid-sentence, walked directly to the nearest radio, and without any hesitation at all, keyed into that frequency and started talking. I want you to sit in that moment with me, because I think it's the emotional center of this entire story. 4 months of quiet, 4 months of being nobody in particular to anyone in that room. And in 4 seconds, none of that mattered anymore, because there was a struggling pilot and a dying patient on the other end of that radio, and every single thing Elena had spent a decade becoming came back online at once, instantly, completely, like it had never actually left. What followed over the next roughly 16 minutes became, almost immediately, one of the more remarkable things that base's tower crew had ever witnessed. Elena walked that struggling medical transport pilot through a systematic diagnosis of his aircraft's mechanical problem, identifying from his description alone exactly which system was failing and exactly how much time that gave him before the situation became genuinely unrecoverable. She helped him identify a viable landing option considerably better suited to his aircraft's compromised state than the airfield he'd originally been heading toward, recalculating a new approach in real time with a fluency that left the young controller standing next to her, according to his own account, watching someone speak a language I didn't even know she knew. She talked that pilot through an approach and landing sequence adjusted specifically for his failing systems. Her voice, according to every single witness in that tower, never once rising, never once carrying even a hint of the tension that everyone else in the room was visibly holding on to. The aircraft came down hard but controlled, tires touching a runway that, minutes earlier, hadn't even been part of the flight plan, and both the pilot and his critically injured patient made it to the ground alive, with emergency medical crews already waiting, thanks in no small part to the extra minutes of stability Elena's guidance had bought them. For a few seconds after that aircraft rolled to a stop, according to the young controller, absolutely nobody in that tower said anything at all, because there wasn't really anything that needed saying that would have added to what they'd all just watched happen. It didn't take long for the rest of the base to hear some version of what had happened, and it didn't take much longer for someone to ask the obvious question: who exactly was the instructor who'd just talked a stranger through one of the most technically demanding emergency landings that base's tower crew had witnessed in years? When Elena's actual service record surfaced, fully, for the first time to anyone at that regional wing, it landed with the specific kind of weight that makes people go back and rethink every quiet, unremarkable interaction they'd ever had with her. The squadron commander, reviewing that record personally later that same evening, found himself sitting with a fairly uncomfortable realization that one of the most experienced, most technically decorated pilots on his entire base had spent 4 months teaching basic training sorties largely unnoticed because nobody had ever bothered to ask her a single question deep enough to learn any of it. He met with her the following day, not to reprimand anyone, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how something like that happens. Elena, from what I understand, wasn't especially dramatic about the conversation. She told him simply that some parts of a career are easier to leave quiet than to explain, and that she'd never felt any particular need to make sure people knew, because the work itself had always been enough for her, whether anyone was watching it closely or not. Word of what happened that Tuesday spread through the base in the specific way these stories do, and in the weeks that followed, something shifted, quietly, the way real change usually happens. The younger pilots who'd sat through 4 months of her classes without ever really seeing her started actually asking her questions, real ones, the kind that come from genuine curiosity rather than routine politeness. Her call sign, once known only to a small circle from a chapter of her career nobody at that base had any context for, started getting used out loud, and it started carrying weight the moment people finally understood exactly what it meant and exactly what she'd done to earn it. What stays with me most about this story isn't really the 16 minutes on that radio, remarkable as they were. It's the 4 months before it, 4 months of a genuinely extraordinary pilot being quietly filed away as unremarkable, not out of malice, but out of the simple, common human habit of assuming that quiet people don't have much worth asking about. She never needed the recognition. She'd have kept teaching those classes in total anonymity forever, probably, if that radio call had never come through. But I think that's exactly what makes this story land the way it does. Greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits, patiently, quietly, for the moment it's actually needed, and shows up completely intact the second that moment finally arrives. So here's my question for you tonight, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think it's on all of us, individually, to make more effort to actually get to know the quiet people around us? Or do you think, realistically, in a world moving as fast as ours does, some of this is simply unavoidable? And tell me the other thing too. Before I told you her call sign, had you already started suspecting that this quiet instructor was going to turn out to be someone with a story considerably bigger than anyone around her realized? If this story kept you here tonight, subscribe before you go, because this channel exists entirely for exactly these moments, the ones nobody notices, right up until the second they can't be unnoticed anymore. And if there's someone quiet in your own life you've been meaning to actually ask about, maybe let this be the nudge. And if you've got a story like Elena's, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.